All right. In the interest of time, I want to get us rolling. As folks join us, Randy, you might want to put into the chat. I'm going to give a little bit of housekeeping, but you might want to put those things into the chat for anyone who might join after the kickoff of the program. So welcome everyone. I am Amy Sings in the Timber. I'm the executive director of the Montana Innocence Project. And we have the great pleasure tonight of co-hosting with the Montana chapter of the Black Law Students Association this panel discussion regarding mass incarceration and 13. I just want to go over a couple little housekeeping things. The chat feature is limited. It is restricted to moderator and administrator. And so any questions that you might have, you can put into the chat and they will be keeping tabs on those and addressing them at the appropriate time. Also, we will be recording this this panel discussion so that anyone who was not able to join would be able to access it from our website, our social media, and a YouTube link as well. If you do not wish to have your image recorded, I would suggest canceling the video on your screen. And so without further ado, I just want to introduce our moderator for the evening. Alicia Miles is the Director of Admissions at the Alexander Blewett III School of Law. And I will kick it over to Alicia at this point.
Thank you, Amy. And I will use this opportunity to again say welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. And also introduce our panelists for this evening. First, we have Courtney Smith, she, her. She is the Montana Racial Equity Project's Criminal Justice Initiative lead. And on my screen, I see everyone in a row. So as I call your name, will you just kind of light your square up so people know kind of where you're at on their screen. So Courtney Smith.
I don't know what you mean by light up my screen. This is me. I'm Courtney Smith.
that works. Next, we have Akilah Lane, she, her, a civil rights staff attorney with the ACLU of Montana.
Hi, everyone.
And SK Rossi, they, them, the founder of Central House Strategies and the former director of Advocacy and Policy at the ACLU of Montana.
Hey, everyone.
So we are going to dive right in, and I'm going to start with Rossi. America incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. I'll say that again just to let it sink in. America incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. Further, the incarceration rate of Black people is more than 5 times higher than the incarceration rate of white people. Considering these numbers and the facts laid out in the documentary 13th, how is mass incarceration a form of modern-day slavery? And in what ways does the criminal legal system today perpetuate the intentions of slavery?
Thanks, Alicia, and thanks everybody for being here. It's an honor to be invited to even be a part of this panel. It's a very important topic, and the criminal legal system is something that is, it's the system I hate most that exists within American governments. I do not have as many opportunities to rant publicly about it as I normally would since leaving the ACLU, so I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to rant about it with you today. This is a hard question to answer in a 1-hour panel. I feel like you could teach an entire semester, if not an entire year, on how the American carceral system is a perpetuation and really imitation of slavery. So I just want to say that as a way to say I apologize if I glossed over things that seem very important. I just want to make sure that I'm giving you an answer that kind of encompasses the history between slavery and now that is complete. And if it's not as nuanced and as reflective as I would like it to be, I hope you understand that is because of time constraints and not because I don't think certain things are important. So as quickly as I can, because I want to leave more time for the other questions and for you all to hear from Courtney and Akilah. Slavery, obviously, as we all know, because of the 1619 Project, technically started in 1619. There's a common misconception that there were like these specific eras of the oppression of Black people starting with slavery, and that slavery was here, and then Jim Crow laws were here, and then the Civil Rights era was here, and et cetera. But a lot of the laws that were meant to oppress and imprison Black people when slavery started actually started soon after slavery, so like in the 1660s. So as early as the 1660s, there were laws on the books, the first of which were anti-miscegenation laws that prohibited people from two different races from marrying each other, that were used to punish Black people. And before we kind of had this mass explosion of a carceral institution through jails and prisons, the most likely punishment for the breaking of these laws was death. And if it wasn't death, it was severe physical abuse. So even though slavery started in 1619 and ended in 1865, and then there was this whole era of laws that perpetuated after the technical end of slavery, the laws that punished Black people disproportionately, unfairly, and inhumanely started as early as the 1600s. So when the era of slavery was at its peak, slavery is what created the first police forces through like organized slave patrols. And while they weren't necessarily government sanctioned, they were the first kind of organized vigilante groups that were quote unquote enforcing the law by capturing slaves who had escaped their enslavement and taking them back to the places at which they were enslaved. As late as I said, some of those laws outside of slave patrols, most of the punishment during the slave patrol era was just going back to your enslavement. It wasn't necessarily death. And that is because the purpose of slavery was and again, I'm sorry, I'm just glossing over this, and this is just this truncated version of what I'm trying to share with you, was the commodification of Black people, was to use slaves for profit to benefit the power and wealth of white people, especially white people in government. So through about the 1670s, slave patrols and kind of anti-miscegenation laws were the main enforcement mechanism for punishing slaves and Black people in America. In 1860, the 1860 is kind of seen as the end of the slave trade, meaning that slaves it wasn't legally sanctioned to bring Black people from Africa to the United States for the purpose of slavery anymore. It obviously still happened, but the legal slave trade market was ended in 1860. In 1865, with the passage of the 13th Amendment, that was technically the end of legal slavery. But again, and what you're going to see through the rest of the few minutes I'm going to talk is that every time there was a law passed to attempt to end the slavery, oppression, commodification, dehumanization, subjugation, control, separation of Black people, there were laws immediately passed to essentially continue the institution of slavery in a different form that got around the purportedly helpful pieces of law that were passed. So when the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, it has this loophole in it that basically said except as punishment. So unless you break a law, you cannot be enslaved, but if you break a law, you can be enslaved. And that was kind of the first catalyst for white slave owners and white government officials and white people in power to say, well, now what do we do? And what they did was they basically started a leasing system for prisoners. So they would incarcerate Black people at an enormous rate. And instead of saying that they were slaves under the old system, they were incarcerated people, or they were under the penal system, under the new system, and then they would lease those people out for labor. So it was essentially just slavery under a different name, under a leasing system run by governments instead of private ownership. So there was no actual break in the forced labor of Black folks between slavery and the 13th Amendment. It just continued via the carceral system. During the period of Reconstruction, which was late 60s to 1860s, late 1870s, Reconstruction failed. The North completely abdicated, any responsibility for making sure that freedmen in the South were protected. Once the slave owners came back to power in the South, they immediately started passing law after law after law prohibiting Black people from doing everything under the sun. Of course, it was about voting, but it was also making sure that they could continue to control Black people's bodies and enslave them for manual labor. So they passed laws for anything from anti-miscegenation laws were all across the country. Black people couldn't vote, they couldn't own property, they could only work in very specific sectors, and it was usually farm work and domestic labor. So just as they had done during slavery, all of the separate but equal laws came to fruition. I mean, at some point there were laws that literally prohibited Black people from expressing joy in public. I mean, any little thing they could think of to incarcerate Black people, that's what they did, so they could then use their labor for free via the carceral system. So during the Jim Crow era, obviously, which was 1877 to 1964, these laws proliferated. There was a greater pushback. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, and it was signed by Johnson. And coincidentally, it's not coincidence at all, and this is exactly what I'm talking about. They passed the Civil Rights Act, the president signed it, and then 5 years later, when the presidency flipped to Nixon, Nixon declared a war on drugs, which is essentially a new era of getting around laws that were meant to end the oppression of Black people. So instead of Jim Crow laws that were being used time and time again to incarcerate Black people and force them into labor and servitude via the carceral system, they were now using a false alarm about the crack epidemic ignoring the amount of cocaine being used by white people to incarcerate Black folks and continue to use their labor via the prison system. So this happened again in 1994. So Reagan kind of perpetuated this racist system that Nixon instituted via these anti-drug laws. Reagan made it absolutely worse with all of his anti-drug acts. And these are all, again, I think very transparently driven by the desire to incarcerate and control Black people. And then in 1994, the Clintons signed the crime bill. Bill Clinton signed the crime bill. Hillary Clinton went up calling Black children super predators. And this entire explosion of incarceration happened. And it went from, if you look at the graph, it's 1996, 97, 98, but leading up, it just starts going up. It was kind of a steady build like this, and then it's and it's because of that crime bill. And that crime bill, while the Clintons always said, oh, Black community leaders were asking us to pass this, what Black community leaders were asking for was investment in their communities, economic development, better education, all these things that would have actually benefited Black communities, and help with crime rates. So the Clintons took the help with crime rates piece, used it to their own benefit, and just shoved hundreds of millions of dollars towards greater policing, jails, all these things that would just increase incarceration of Black people across the country. And I don't think they've ever actually apologized for it. I think Joe Biden might have. It doesn't matter if they apologized or not, but they lied about the reason for it. They ignored the actual requests of Black people in terms of community improvement, picked the crime piece, and then ran with it to essentially appear tough on crime so they could get reelected. The one thing that I want to mention very quickly about this kind of progression of law passed to help, quote unquote, help Black people, new laws passed to get around that law passed to help, new law passed to get around it, and how the criminal justice system or the criminal legal system has been used at every step of the way to get around those laws. It's always more criminalization. It's always more criminalization that they try to figure out to get around these laws that are supposed to create equilibrium and equity in the criminal legal system. The explosion of private prisons in the late 90s, early 2000s was actually led by this fucking guy named Terrell I can't remember his last name, but he's from Texas. He was a literal plantation owner in Texas. And he built a prison system in Texas that essentially used Black prisoners to work plantations in Texas. He owned the largest one. He literally had an incarcerated Black man living and working in his home as if he were a slave to the family. And he was so impressed with himself that he created this system of essentially slavery via incarceration in Texas in the 90s, that Arkansas paid him to essentially revamp their entire carceral system and do the same thing in Arkansas. And he's the founder of Corrections Corporation for America. He's the beginning of the private prison industry. So again, it's this commodification of Black people and Black bodies. And every time there's a step toward ending that commodification, the people in power who do not wish to see their power taken from them, who would prefer to see Black people disenfranchised, in any number of ways, there's a reason they don't want people with felony convictions to be able to vote. And it's because people with felony convictions are oftentimes people who are Black, and people with felony convictions also can't sit on juries. And if you're not registered to vote, you can't sit on juries. Like, the entire system is stacked to keep Black people from having any power in the system. Regardless, the private prison system is kind of the apex of this entire thing. And the charge for the privatization of prisons is led by a literal plantation owner, whose plantation was populated by incarcerated Black people forced to work his land. So it's basically come full circle. That was the answer was much too long. I'm so sorry, but I hope that was enough history.
It's okay, we can make it up on the back end. Thank you for that. Our next question goes to Courtney. Courtney, the preschool to prison pipeline, over-policing of BIPOC communities, the private prison system, the war on drugs, and cash bail are just a few contributors to mass incarceration. Can you speak to a cause of mass incarceration that you address through your work at your organization?
Sure. First, I want to say thank you, Alicia, for introducing me. I also wanted to add that the Montana Racial Equity Project is the only BIPOC-led and all BIPOC staffed nonprofit organization in the state of Montana. And so we advocate for people through an inclusive BIPOC lens. And first of all, if we look at the criminal legal system, the greatest disparities in punishment begin at initial contact with police. So we at MTREP are actively working on police reform measures with police departments across the state. Recently, we were a part of a working group which advanced a civilian review board there in Helena, which I hope will lead to more civilian review boards across the state. I feel like they're the most important reform measure that there is. You need some type of oversight of police with regard to citizen complaints, especially for use of force complaints, which are so ubiquitous. Civilian involvement also allows for ordinary citizens to see how they can be involved in public safety and how all of us can be involved in ensuring safe communities. So we definitely advocate for civilian review boards across the state. We're also working to disrupt the school to prison pipeline. We're specifically addressing the overuse of school resource officers in school districts across the state. This is another area that creates racial disparities that exist in punishment here in Montana. So we're hoping to support these efforts in Helena recently, but we faced a lot of entrenched resistance from the community. We worked with the ACLU and Akilah there in Helena to try to push the working group to actually look at what the role of an SRO is, what function they truly serve in schools. Unfortunately, a school resource officer has never prevented a school shooting in this country. And given the racial impact that these school resource officers have on communities, we just advocate that they should not be in schools at all. We're also working to ensure accurate data and data transparency here in Montana. There have been several instances in which we found discrepancies between state data and local data. I'll give a specific example. In Yellowstone County, it was reported that there were only a handful of school resource officer arrests that they reported to the state in their court data in 2019. But in Billings, which is in Yellowstone County, their police department's own report indicated that there were approximately 400 arrests of students by SROs. So we want to ensure accountability in reporting. We want to ensure accurate reporting because that reporting informs what we do in advocating for BIPOC people across the state of Montana. And Most importantly, we act as a resource for marginalized people and allow BIPOC stories to be at the forefront of our work. We serve as a resource in this state where we are few and far between, particularly as a Black person. So a lot of times we get reports and incidents of racism, and we help people navigate the complex system that exists through attorney referrals and equity, inclusion, and justice consulting work. And we also have people working in education reform and health awareness and reform as well. So those are some of the ways that MTREP is working to address some of the root causes of mass incarceration here.
Thank you, Courtney. And before we log off today, can you please put your organization's website in the chat so that anyone on the Zoom today that wants to visit your organization later, they can do that?
Sure, I'll do that.
Thank you. So, Akilah, the documentary 13th details how our society has come to associate BIPOC persons with criminality. How do these stereotypes persist in our country and in Montana specifically?
Hi, Alicia. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here tonight. I'm just assuming that everyone watched the documentary, but nonetheless, I think that I would just like to start by kind of underscoring the importance of really considering the genesis of all racial stereotyping, even if the focus of the conversation is modern day, because I don't think that we can underscore the importance of how these racial stereotypes came to be and why they came to be. Especially, I think Rossi kind of gave a good summary of how the criminal legal system was, the origin was just to criminalize Black people so that white dominant culture could continue to profit off of their labor. And I think specifically in Montana, if we think about Native communities, we know that the colonizers, when they came here in order to justify their inhumane and genocidal treatment of Native Americans, that they created stereotypes of Natives as savage and less evolved and of inherent inferiority to them. And so as we see, these racial stereotypes continue and persist, I think that it's important to understand the power of rhetoric and how it plays on fears and creates social norms and informs systems of social control. And specifically associating Black people and brown people, Indigenous people with criminality gives the dominant culture the power to, it's been kind of the most effective tool in continuing the relegation of BIPOC people, especially those who live in poverty, to a form of second-class citizenship, because once someone's labeled a criminal, it makes it much easier for dominant culture, the majority of people, to not empathize with them anymore, and it makes it easier for them to be stripped of their rights. So legally barred from voting, all the other restrictions we place once someone has come into contact with the criminal legal system. So not only are there social repercussions, but also even being able to get a job, being able to get social benefits. It's the most effective way of keeping brown people disenfranchised from society. So, and we continue to see the use of stereotypes to justify horrendous treatments and the othering of different racial and ethnic groups in this country. It makes people comfortable with, I think, like allowing Khalif Browder, for example, to linger at Rikers for 3 years, suffering unimaginable abuse before his untimely death, all because he was falsely accused of a crime he was never even convicted, and he could not afford bail imposed, and everyone was okay with it. Like, those 3 years that he lingered, there wasn't national coverage until he was dead. And many people just assumed, you heard people say, well, if he didn't commit a crime this time, then probably there was another time that he did commit a crime. And we see this over and over again. We hear people dismissing unlawful killings by law enforcement officers and the use of excessive force by law enforcement officers. And we see people just saying, well, you know, if they didn't commit the crime today, then they probably committed a different crime a different day. And then when those officers have a hearing or a trial, then we also see that the focus and the media focus and attention is always looking at the victim to try to figure out their criminal past. So not necessarily even the crime that they were charged with or that they're suspected of committing on that day. We see them looking at the whole criminal past or drug use or anything to continue to associate the brown people with just being criminals, essentially. And we do that in order to justify the inhumane treatment of brown people in this country. And I think we see it, like, those are the more obvious ways, and we've seen it play out over and over again. I think in the last several years under the Trump administration, when we heard him say things that were very purposefully meant to link brown people to criminality, like when over the summer, for example, during the George Floyd protest, we heard Trump and other of his supporters refer to peaceful protesters as thugs. We heard Trump refer to majority Black cities as rat infested. We heard, we heard him Trump and his party refer to people who immigrate to this country as terrorists, as caravans of people coming to steal your jobs and rape your daughters. And we saw that it worked. We saw that, you know, many people felt comfortable with the internment and separation of immigrant families for crossing over illegally because of this rhetoric. We heard people justify that treatment and say, well, you know, they do the crime, do the time, like they shouldn't have come over illegally. And so just by equating people to criminals, then it makes people feel more comfortable with treating them as less than human. And I think we also see this show up, or not I think, I know that we also see this show up at a really early age in this country in the adultification of BIPOC students and children. So we see that, you know, as Courtney referenced, we were part of the SRO working group, and ACLU Montana a few years ago released our empty desk reports, which chronicles and looks at the disproportionate treatment of Native and other minority students in Montana by, the disproportionate treatment of them by how they are disciplined far more harshly for the same exact behaviors of their white counterparts. So, and this kind of starts the beginning of their exclusion from society in the form of exclusionary discipline. And we saw in that report that Indigenous youth have disproportionate police contact with law enforcement, greater than any other minority group, and they experience the highest disparities. So they lost nearly 6 times the amount of instruction as white students and were arrested more than 7 times as often as white students. So we see in their treatment right there, that's evidence of, like, even though they're doing the same exact treatment, because they're brown people, we already are associating them as criminals, and we're already pushing them into contact with the criminal legal system. And I think I've gone on and on, so I'm going to pass it to the next question because I know we only have 3 minutes.
Thank you. So our next question goes to Courtney. According to the National Registry of Exonerations, almost half of all wrongfully convicted people who have been freed are Black. Ava DuVernay explores the topic of wrongful conviction in 13th, as well as in her limited series, When They See Us, about the Central Park Five. How do wrongful convictions contribute to mass incarceration?
Okay. First of all, I want to reiterate, like you did earlier, that we've built a system in which half of all wrongfully convicted individuals are Black. And that's absolutely unacceptable and kind of why we do this work, I guess. So I guess I would say that overcriminalization generally is where I would start with why wrongful convictions contribute to mass incarceration. I think the Innocence Project's own research showed that 73% of women who were exonerated in the last 3 decades were wrongfully convicted of crimes that actually never occurred, including accidents and fabricated crimes. So California and their 3-strike laws come to mind. And there are similar measures adopted in about 26 other states. And these laws lead to increased sentencing for sometimes misdemeanor crimes, especially amongst those who are most heavily surveilled, Black and Brown communities in particular. I'm thinking about Dante Wright as an example. He was shot and killed by police in Minnesota after he was initially pulled over for having an air freshener hanging from his rear view mirror. And finally, just recently, Georgia criminalized handing out water at polling locations. So I think all of these examples illustrate how our everyday lives and actions are over-criminalized, and that in itself leads to mass incarceration. And it also speaks to how Black and Brown people in particular are targeted by this system, especially with the law in Georgia and voting and that being criminalized in and of itself. I also want to touch on just the societal and individual harm caused by wrongful convictions. We can't really rely on a criminal legal system that makes even one mistake in convicting an innocent person. How can we as a society have trust and faith in a system that wrongfully convicts people to begin with? I mean, that's why we have the Innocence Project. But our extreme consequences also lead to individuals losing their lives, their livelihoods, their relationships. And there are a lot of stories about wrongfully convicted people, for example, languishing in prisons for years, who miss the opportunity to say goodbye to loved ones who die while they're incarcerated. And so when you think about the detriment and the generational harm this causes, when people lose out on the ability to raise their children, mothers and fathers, and then those children are consequently more likely to be incarcerated themselves. So in some ways, it's just a system that perpetuates itself and leads to more harm and trauma, especially for those who are poor and those who are Black and Brown disproportionately.
Thank you. Akilah, this event is intended to bring awareness to the discrimination that Black people face in the criminal legal system. But we also want to recognize the unique demographics of mass incarceration in Montana. Indigenous people comprise only 6.6% of Montana's population. However, Indigenous women make up 32.74% of the women's prison population, and Indigenous men make up 20.23% of the men's prison population. Can you explain one or more of the causes behind the over-incarceration of Indigenous people in Montana and how this could potentially be remediated?
Thanks. I'm actually going to keep my answer to this really short, because I think part of the problem is that I'm here speaking on behalf of a population of which I'm not a part of, and that and that I'm asked for my suggestions on remedying the problems. I think the experts on communities, especially those impacted communities, are those who have lived in those communities, those who advocate, organize, who have their feet on the ground, who understand the culture and the reality of lived experience there. And I think that that's of the utmost important, especially when we're talking about Indigenous communities in Montana, because one, they're not a monolith. Two, any remedy needs to be culturally competent. And so I am not culturally competent to provide those remedies. I think, I think part of the problem is, for instance, I don't think most people realize that Native Americans are killed by police at the highest rate in this country, higher than any other group. And most people don't know that because most of the information related to Native experience, I feel like Natives are invisible in so many ways. They're invisible in this room today, even though they're greatly impacted, and they're, a large minority group in Montana. And I think that, that's part of the problem. And I think it's our job, especially the job, it makes sense to have us here today because on the celebrations for Juneteenth, but if we're going to ask questions related specifically to Native people, then the Native organizers, community leaders, and other stakeholders need to be invited as well. And I think that for the people in this community, on this panel, in the greater community, who have political power, who have political will and relationships, then in order to remedy these, the over-incarceration of Native people, then it is upon us to go into those communities and ask for their guidance and support them in their leadership in tackling the problems that they see, and to do so in a way that they think is best for their communities. And so that's all I will say. I mean, I could say like all the other, like the things that we know that about poverty and lack of resource and lack of opportunity, but I think that that's pretty basic and well understood and would just be providing lip service. So,
yeah. Thank you. So as we are coming to the end of our prepared questions, I would like to remind everyone that the chat is open to the hosts. So you are welcome to drop any questions that you have in that chat box at the bottom of your screen, and then we will answer those after we wrap up our prepared questions. So to that end, Rossi, can you provide one or more action steps that our audience members can take to advocate for an end to mass incarceration?
Sure. I mean, I think, so I've been asked this question a bunch of times. And my first answer is always, give your money to organizations that are led by Black and brown people. That's always my first answer. But I've been thinking about it a little bit more lately. And this answer is going to be directed at white people in Montana, because that's the action items I've thought about for myself, and they're the ones that I'm most qualified to speak to. So to the white people listening to this, the first action item, which is honestly a lesson I learned from Akilah a couple years ago, which I didn't really have words for at the time, but has stuck with me, is just that you have to believe people. Like you as a white person need to train yourself to automatically believe Black and brown people when they tell you about their experiences, not just in the criminal legal system, but just in life, especially in living their lives in Montana, where I can only assume it is an exceptionally hard place to live if you are not white. So that's my first one, like just believe people. The second thing is obviously donate to organizations that are led by Black and brown people. Give your money to MT-Rep. Give your money to organizations that are staffed by people who are from the communities that are victims most of the carceral system and of policing. Third, I would say read a book. I mean, I'm listing things that take like little to no effort. I was recently told to read Caste by Isabel Wilkerson from a friend of mine, and I started reading it, and it makes my stomach hurt every chapter, and I have to take a break. So read Caste and try to make yourself start thinking about these issues differently and more deeply. And I would recommend you read that book with a group of friends, because you should have someone to talk to about it while you're going through it. The next is probably, if you want to change power structures and you want to change the carceral system, you need to support leadership for positions of power. You need to support leadership in the BIPOC community. And lastly, and I think the hardest one, and this is basically, I'm just like kind of listing like levels of sacrifice that white people can make, from like little to a lot. And the last one, which is something that I personally struggle with, and I'm sure all white people in positions that have some sort of power struggle with, is to give it up, move on, make space for BIPOC people to take up power in spaces that can advocate and make a difference, make more space in the institutions you're a part of, and step aside when it's time to step aside, and stand in the background and be supportive for once in your life. That's all I've got.
Ooh, I will add. I will add, I think that especially this is also like directly, I'm talking to white people right now, is do the work to figure out how to help resource those communities. So that means, again, taking a back seat, asking how you can help, asking how they can lead, asking what work you can do to help them heal the specific historical and present day traumas that they experience just as living as a BIPOC person in these communities. And that can look like a variety of things. So how can you help to resource these communities in the ways that they tell you to?
And I will add on the education part in the training aspect, a lot of people just want to go to a training and say, well, I'm fixed now. And it requires constant self-reflection. It requires constant education and relearning and unlearning some of your old habits, not just simply saying, I went to an implicit bias training once, so now I know all about racism and I'm fixed as a white person. You have to keep educating yourself and put the things that you learn into actual practice.
Thank you. So we do have 2 questions in the chat. So we'll start with this first one, and this is open to all of our panelists. I'm curious to know the panelists' thoughts on the congressional action declaring Juneteenth a federal holiday. I've seen reactions from, yay, we did it, to this will just get bastardized like MLK Day, to Election Day should have been a holiday first and focus on Black voting rights, etc. So I will open the floor for each of your thoughts.
So it's like what we think about it. I think it's great that it's now a nationally recognized federal holiday. It's not enough. And also, you know, it's like, it's a little step, but it comes at the same time when like everyone sees this, like in Montana, the Knutson's move to make it illegal to teach critical race theory. So it's crazy. We're like, yay, let's have this national holiday, even though around the nation, everyone's like, let's not actually teach anything about this national holiday. So in order for anything like this to have any meaning, then there has to be continued education around it. There has to be more than just like, we get a day off of work. Okay, and that's great. We should have had that for a long time. Let's do a lot more. Let's make it meaningful. Let's make it have teeth.
Muted. Courtney or Rossi, anything to add?
No, not really. I mean, Akilah said what needed to be said. Juneteenth, I mean, I've grown up celebrating it just because I happen to be from the South, and it's expanded across the country, but the historical meaning behind it is something that we've been pushing for a long time, and not just Juneteenth having a holiday, but actually celebrating the end of slavery for all people in this country.
Well, then I will move to our second question from the audience. And this is again to all panelists. How do we deal with the complexity of the culture, addressing the beauty that comes from Black culture, dancing, hip hop, etc., but at the same time popularizing and normalizing self-destructive behavior such as gang and or drug culture?
Can you state the question again, please?
How do we deal with the complexity of the culture, addressing the beauty that comes from Black culture, as in dancing or hip hop, etc., but at the same time popularizing and normalizing the self-destructive behavior of gang and or drug culture?
Okay, I think, how do we deal with the complexity of the culture? I think this question is related to lateral oppression, which we've been talking about a lot lately, at least in my friendship circles. And it seems like we just have to, I mean, what I would say as a starting place is recognizing that we as brown and Black people in this country are traumatized people. Like, our history, our legacy is of trauma. And so much of those behaviors that were just listed are trauma responses. So what do you do with trauma? You heal it. So the way that we, like, of course it's complex because we are traumatized people, and the work we need to do is figure out how to heal our people. And the way that we do that is starting by reforming or abolishing the systems that keep us, that keep re-traumatizing us, right? We've never had the opportunity to fully heal as a people in any way. Like, yes, Juneteenth, we were freed as slaves, but we have been kept in servitude, as we are seeing, as everything that we've discussed today has shown. So, and as Courtney said, like, the traumatizations of families being ripped apart and all of that. So I think that how we deal with it is we deal with it with compassion and understanding, and recognize where some of that behavior is coming from. And even if it is popularized, understanding why it's popularized too, because oftentimes, you know, like the drug dealers and communities and stuff, those were the people that were making money. Like, that's fucking great if you're starving and then there's some way to provide food and opportunity for your family because you've been shut out of every other way to have opportunity, then there needs to be recognition of that. So I think that we have to look at it with a compassionate lens, and then do the work to try to heal our communities.
Thank you. So I am not seeing any additional questions in the chat. So I would like to give each of our panelists a couple moments for a last thoughts. If you have any last thoughts that you'd like to share, we do have plenty of time, so feel free to share any last thoughts. And if not, then we can wrap up. We'll start with Courtney.
Well, I guess I'll wrap up by saying, as Rossi said, support the Montana Racial Equity Project. And I mean, these are very serious issues that exist here in Montana. Oftentimes, I talk to people who kind of want to deflect and talk about how small our population here is of Black people, of BIPOC people, but these disparities in punishment, overcriminalization, mass incarceration, it exists right here. And you need to work to dismantle that system right here in your own backyard. Not just talk about things that are going on in other places because that feels more comfortable, but actually thinking about the action steps that we can take here in our society, right here in Montana, to address mass incarceration.
Thank you. Rossi, any last thoughts?
I don't think so. I'm mostly thinking about, on full disclosure, I'm mostly thinking about how I probably shouldn't have been on this panel and I didn't need to be. And probably I should have suggested other panelists instead of participating myself who are actually Black, Indigenous, or POC. So I'm going to think about that. And I think that in the future, if panels that are about a community, a specific community like the Black community, the Indigenous community, should be populated by people from those communities. And that's something I'm going to take away from this. And I hope everybody else does too.
Thank you for that transparent moment. And Akilah, any last minute thoughts?
I think my only thoughts would be in our work to dismantle these systems of oppression, that at the same time, contemporaneously, we do the work to resource and heal communities, because that's the only way that the movement will be successful.
Thank you. So no additional questions in the chat. Thank you all for joining us today, and a big, big, big thank you to our panelists. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your day to talk to us about mass incarceration, Montana, and the 13th documentary. So thank you everyone, and have a great evening.